To start, I'd like to start by obviously welcoming Chris Wright. And I could say welcome back, Chris Wright. Some 17 years since you were last at UNSW. Chris's first academic gig was here, wasn't it?
1991.
By way of introduction, Chris is a Professor of Organisational Studies at the University of Sydney Business School, where he teaches and researches organisational change, innovation and sustainability. He's also a researcher, a key researcher at the Sydney Environment Institute, where he heads up a group examining corporate climate transition. His research focuses on organisational and societal responses to climate change, specifically in regard to corporate environmentalism and organisational justification, compromise, risk and future management. His research is very widely cited and has received many accolades, as well as some criticism, of course, Chris, which you would expect, I'm afraid. The reason I say that is because Chris's research, I think, asks difficult, challenging, and often controversial questions of corporations and governments that need to be addressed to make significant headway in respect of climate change. I'm going to leave it there because Chris will talk very much about his programme of research through this particular presentation, and very much looking forward to it. So over to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thanks, David, and thanks everybody for turning up and having the chance to chat to you about this. When David reached out to present to you guys, there were a number of papers I sort of offered, but this was the one that he thought would resonate best. And really, it's a sort of an overview of the research that myself and my colleague Daniel Nyberg and more recent colleague Vanessa Bowden have been doing for some years now. I was looking back, started on the climate change sort of focus in the research about 15 years ago or more. So yeah, time flies when you're having fun. And so the title of the paper today, Confronting the Fossil Fuel Hegemony in an Era of Climate Crisis, the Politics of Mitigation, Adaptation and Suffering. So it's based sort of on this book that we brought out, came out last year, early last year. And it was an attempt to bring together stuff that we'd been writing in various academic papers over the years, and an update of a book, another book that we did in 2015 on climate change. So that's what I'm going to address. Yeah, just you're wondering what that image is. That's one of the coal loaders up at Kooragang Island, 2 hours north of Newcastle, the world's largest coal port, where we export a lot of thermal coal to the world. Okay, so let me get into it. And as David said, what I'm going to go through maybe confronting, I don't know, maybe quite critical. You know, let's chat about it afterwards and see what you make of it. So yeah, the book came out early last year, and we wrote this basically, we started sort of writing it up right when COVID broke, so early 2020, and we had sort of 2 years of writing in our various places on Zoom, sending drafts backwards and forwards, but it was good to get the thing out. And I'll talk about the themes in that book towards the end of this presentation, because I want to go through a few things before I get to that. Okay, so this is a little personal story in the beginning. This is South Stane, Manly Beach. It's September 2006, and it was a lovely sunny Sunday, and my wife and I were entertaining some of her relatives from rural Queensland who'd come down to see the North Queensland Cowboys play a rugby league semi-final, I think it was at the time. And the conversation at a rather nice restaurant out of shot there over lunch was they were bemoaning the fact that their kids and their grandkids no longer wanted to work on the huge pastoral property that they owned. It was, it's a massive property, 4 hours drive west of Mackay. It's one of those properties that goes for thousands of hectares. I don't know, it's huge, big Brahman cattle. And they were the people that innovated in the use of helicopters and small planes to muster the cattle. So that's how big the properties are. And the reason they said the kids and the grandkids didn't want to work on pastoral property was they could work in the nearby open cut coal mines that were expanding in that area near the Galilee Basin. And they can make much more money working these long shifts. And at the time I said, I was at UNSW, and the economists were running around talking about the Stern report is coming out, and he's going to argue that climate change is the greatest market failure and we need to price carbon emissions. And so I bravely said, well, look, don't worry, because the Stern report's coming out. I've just seen Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. The world's waking up to climate change. We're going to price carbon emissions. We're going to price pollution from fossil energy, and the coal industry's cactus. And of course, that didn't happen. And so here we are. Australia is amongst the world's largest exporters of coal and natural gas, methane gas to the world. We compete with Qatar and we compete with Indonesia for those titles. We're seeing ever more extreme weather events, and I'll come back to them in a moment. And the political response is typically, Australia is just a small fish in a bigger pond. We don't produce that much emissions. There's not much we can do. If we don't sell the coal and gas, somebody else will, the drug dealers' defence, that sort of thing. So there's a whole political obfuscation that has occurred within Australia and obviously in other parts of the world, like the US and Canada and Britain and other places, other petrostates, about why any attempt to curtail fossil fuel extraction and use must be prevented at all costs, because that's just the way things are. And in the book, we use this concept of hegemony, which I'll be coming back to as a sort of a conceptual framework to try and understand that. But that's the Abbott Point terminal, coal terminal. It was built right next to the Great Barrier Reef as a sort of a hub for a lot of that thermal coal coming out of the Galilee, etc. And just quickly, you all know this stuff because a lot of you are climate scientists, and I have to keep updating this figure every year because it gets worse, and God knows what 2024 will look like. Yeah, global average policy is on record. It keeps accelerating. We've had those extreme events like the Black Summer bushfires in Australia, which were the largest, most catastrophic bushfires we've ever seen. Billions of animals destroyed, forests destroyed. I think around 30 people died. And not just Australia, we have this bizarre relationship with California where we're exporting and importing firefighters each summers. The Northern Hemisphere summers. I think this is 2022 when part of London was on fire. The Indian subcontinent with floods. This is happening right now. This heat wave in Southeast Asia is amazingly scary in terms of the records that are being broken. And we've seen heat records broken in South America, terrible heats and floods in Africa. This was, I think, last year, the Rhone or the Rhine, I can't remember, the massive rivers in Europe drying up, the floods in Pakistan. You know all this stuff. The extreme weather events are getting more extreme. The outlying events are becoming sort of a new norm. And so climate change, as we've argued in both books, essentially is, and as many people would acknowledge, probably the most critical challenge we face, perhaps just short of all-out nuclear conflagration between nations or something. But this is for us, a slow-burning phenomenon, but in geological time, very rapid acceleration, human disruption to the climate, and the way that humans as a species have altered the chemistry of the oceans, the atmosphere at amazing pace. This was the Black Summer fires, Blue Mountains, I guess Mount Solitary in the background there. So this was the book that we published in 2015. And really underpinning the research that Daniel and I have been doing over the years is this conundrum that the American journalist Elizabeth Colbert put forward. And she says here, it may seem impossible to imagine that a technologically advanced society could choose in essence to destroy itself. But that is what we are now in the process of doing. And it's that conundrum. A civilization, amazingly technological advancements, we can put people on the moon, we can do amazing things technologically, and yet we can't act to avoid an environmental catastrophe, not just climate disruption, but all of those 9 planetary boundaries that we seem to be breaching. We know that we're doing it, and we know what to do about it technologically and policy-wise, but it's just not happening. So how can that be? Why is that happening? And so that has sort of underpinned a lot of the argument we had in this earlier book and also in a more recent book. And in that earlier book, we riffed on Joseph Schumpeter's and Karl Marx's idea of creative destruction, and we sort of tweaked it to this idea of creative self-destruction, by which we meant that all of the innovative capacities seem to be thrown at exactly the wrong types of outcomes. So this is a shot, I think it was a Shell rig that was being towed in a joint venture with a Russian oil company up to the Arctic to drill for oil. And this is a quote from Bill McKibben on the back of that first book. He said, it's possible there's no greater example of corporate irresponsibility than climate change. These companies melted the Arctic and then rushed to drill in the open water. So we've got this bizarre situation where climate change is denuding the Arctic and the Antarctic and a lot of the ice on the planet. And that opens up new territory for resource extraction, minerals, fossil fuel extraction, oil drilling, deep water oil drilling, the fracking of gas, again, the sort of the innovation of hydraulic fracturing around the world, the the oil sands industry in Alberta in Canada, basically sand with bitumen in it. You apply a lot of heat and water and energy, and you extract the bitumen and you pump it down an oil pipeline to a Texas refinery to eventually get petroleum. So there's a lot of innovative capacity and a lot of financial resources and energy being thrown at getting more coal, oil and gas out of the planet at exactly the time that groups like the International Energy Agency have said there is no budget left for new coal, oil and gas. So there's this complete mismatch between the science, what climate scientists are telling us about what we need to do to avoid catastrophic human-induced global climate disruption, and the political consensus that everything is sweet and we're going to continue to do what we're doing. In fact, we're going to accelerate. We're going to put a foot down on the pedal and extract more coal, oil and gas. And that was rather nicely captured by Bill McKibben way back in 2010, I think it was, in that Rolling Stone article with his 3 numbers. And he said, okay, let's just assume 2 degrees. We don't want to go above 2 degrees. In fact, we know it's 1.5 is probably better. The carbon budget is 565 gigatons. And yet the coal, oil and gas companies, ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, Gazprom, etc., their market value is predicated upon burning 6 times that amount of carbon, because that's what their reserves are monetized on. So the problem is the economics of it, really. We have a global economic system relying on annual compound growth ad infinitum. Economies must keep growing at 3 or 4% per annum. If you're in China, it should be 6, 7, 8%. And that growth requires increased energy consumption, as we know. That relationship, it's a little old now, but that relationship's almost ironclad. More GDP growth, more energy consumption needed. And most of that energy consumption still comes from fossil fuels. I think we started at, if we take 1970, it was around 93% of energy consumption was from coal, oil and gas. We're down to about 82%. But you can see it's still significant. And despite the massive investments in renewables that are happening, energy demand is increasing and we're not really cutting significantly into coal, oil and gas consumption on a global basis anyway, which is what is important. So in both books, we've sort of argued there is this relationship between economics and developed human society as we understand it and fossil energy. Everything we do basically is carbon related in some sense. And you can see that in the data that Richard Heady has produced over the years about human industrial fossil fuel emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, where do they come from? And it's a pretty stunning finding. This was a while back now, in the mid-2010s. 2/3 of cumulative industrial global greenhouse gas emissions between 1750 and 2010 can be attributed to just 90 carbon major fossil fuel companies and state-owned enterprises. Half of those emissions from that 1750 to 2010 period produced since 1986. So there's an acceleration of emissions in the period when we've been having COPs and various international negotiations and growing political awareness of that. And just to highlight the political awareness, I love these. Don't love them, but you know, they are smoking guns. The memos to US presidents. There's actually a better one. It goes back, I think, 65 to Lyndon Johnson. But this is Ehrlichman writing to Nixon in 1969 in a rather sardonic way. Goodbye, New York. Goodbye, Washington. We have no data on Seattle. And this is an advisor to President Carter in 1977, again, alerting them to the scientific evidence around the greenhouse effect, carbon emissions, and what that might do to the planet in terms of extreme weather events, etc. And it wasn't just the politicians, of course, as those journalists and researchers have revealed. In the last few years, there's lots of archival evidence suggesting not just ExxonMobil, most big oil companies had their own internal research scientists predicting exactly where business as usual would take us. And this was this rather famous graph that was produced by Exxon scientists saying, let's imagine the world at 2020. They were writing in 1980, so 40 years into the future. if we keep doing what we're doing, where would atmospheric carbon emissions be? Atmospheric carbon concentrations be? 420 parts per million, bang on. Where would average global warming be? Around 1 degree C. We're at what, 1.1, 1.2. So they weren't far off. They weren't using huge, powerful computers to come to that. And ExxonMobil said, great, thanks for that. Let's put that stuff in the bottom drawer and fund, as has been extremely well documented, a global climate change denial industry of think tanks and compliant conservative media and compliant politicians, et cetera, et cetera. That, of course, is Rex Tillerson, former CEO of ExxonMobil, who went on to become Secretary of State under President Trump. But in 2015, November 2015, just after our first book had come out, there was the Paris climate talks, and the dominant media framing of that was, we're saved. The political leaders have recognised the urgency of climate change, and they've agreed, pledged to avoid 2 degrees and put a lot of effort into trying to avoid greater than 1.5 C average global warming. And so when we actually were doing some of the media for that first book in that period of late 2015, the number of journalists who would come back and say, yeah, but Paris, look, we're saved. You know, there's no problem now. The world's nations have agreed. We're going to avoid global warming. And then we would have to say, yeah, but let's distinguish the pledges and the rhetoric from the reality. And the global fossil fuel burn continues. So again, this disconnect between the political discourse and the corporate discourse and the physical science and the data on emissions and atmospheric carbon. And so some naysayers out there, this is a group that Ian Dunlop, you probably know, has been associated with, Breakthrough down in Melbourne, and they tend to point out the sort of the emperor has no clothes, that the carbon budget to avoid dangerous climate change is basically gone. And we are now confronting dangerous climate change. It's just a question of how bad do you want it? 1.2, 1.5, 2, greater than 2, 3, etc. And a lot of the debate on social media, on climate Twitter or whatever it's called now, Climate X, seems to be between those who want to push a sort of a message that, yes, it's terrible, but it's not too late to avoid even worse outcomes, which I probably agree with, and others who say, well, let's look at what's actually happening now and how realistic is it to assume that we can completely invert the path of global economic development to avoid greater than 2 degrees Celsius. Okay, so that brings us to the book I wanted to discuss and the argument in this, which started with our sort of conundrum that there's all of this growing international commitments to decarbonisation, all of that massive discourse around net zero emissions that came out of the Edinburgh COP. Glasgow COP? 2018. Anyway, the Scottish one. And, you know, a lot of commitments, a lot of corporations jumping on board saying, yeah, we're going to be net zero as well. And this was occurring in the aftermath or alongside this growing upwelling of social mobilisation, the school climate strikes, the Friday for Future, Extinction Rebellion, which was kicking off around that period, 2018, 2019, just before COVID. So these were positive developments, yet you kept looking at what countries like Australia and Canada and the US and Russia and Saudi Arabia were doing. And it was, again, more extraction of coal, oil and gas, more coal-fired power stations being built in developing economies. And so we wanted to sort of unpick this, go back to what we'd looked at in 2015, but broaden it. Because in our earlier book, we focused very much on the corporate sector, and we focused to the exclusion possibly of the role of the state. And we also tended to downplay issues of impacts and differences geographically between the global north and global south. So in the new book, we deliberately tried to restructure our analysis around these 3 themes: climate mitigation, so our emissions, climate adaptation and how that's been framed, and then climate suffering in terms of the unequal outcomes of climate impacts between global north and global south, and again, how that's been framed in Western countries. Conceptually, as I mentioned, we use this concept of hegemony as the sort of the guiding construct here, which, as you probably know, a concept developed by Italian revolutionary Antonio Gramsci in the 20s. He pondered this question as he was thrown in jail by the fascists. Why isn't the working class rising up in revolution against these dictators? And his argument was, well, it goes beyond just simply putting guns to people's heads. It goes beyond simple coercion to force compliance. There is a broader cultural hegemony which is created by the ruling classes which builds connections, builds coalitions of identities and interests between, in his case, it was the church, the state, the media, and other groups, business, corporations and leaders, to create this all-encompassing worldview that the current society is legitimate, the current rulers are legitimate, and everybody should buy into this. So it's essentially sort of an argument around cultural propaganda and ideology. So justifying the power of the rulers as a common sense that becomes so ingrained that you don't even know it exists, you don't even aware of it. So that analogy is often used that it's the water you swim in, you know, and the fish says, what's water? So this sort of idea, there is an overarching sort of view of society and the way it should exist that has become so ingrained we don't even question it, let alone be aware of it. And in Australia, it's not hard to see the fossil fuel hegemony, although it's everywhere. You can find lots of examples of it. Scott Morrison, of course, is then Treasurer, February 2017. This was the week we were hosting Michael Mann at University of Sydney, and he arrived. It was a very, very hot week, and like on the second day, I think it was, this burst onto the media, Morrison waving the lump of coal saying, "This is coal, do not be afraid." And it was a hellishly hot week as well. So it was sort of bizarre vaudevillian politics that was being presented. Gina Reinhardt, world's richest woman, I think, still at one of the big open cuts in Queensland, big lump of coal. In that period in Australia, coal became the sort of the talisman of the fossil fuel hegemony. And really, the creation of this coalition of common interest existed, and we've sort of charted it in various articles we've written, between politicians at state and federal levels, the peak industry groups, what was the Australian Coal Association, became the Minerals Council, the Queensland Resources Council, the major multinational mining companies, Peabody, Glencore, etc., and how that was then diffused to conservative think tanks, the Institute of Public Affairs, Centre for Independent Studies, which has been revealed more recently, a part of the Atlas Network, which is an interesting sort of global aspect to the creation of the hegemony. And then, of course, broadcast in the media. And in Australia, you can't really get away from the impact of the Murdoch media and their control of both print and debates in televised media. So political parties, the media industry associations, think tanks, continuing to recycle the sort of the dominant rhetorics around the power of coal, the importance of coal as baseload energy for Australia, the income that comes from coal and gas, the jobs, the growth, all that stuff. And we've pinched this term from David Levy and Andre Spicer, the rather nice alliteration, fossil fuels forever. It sort of captures this magical thinking that we can just keep doing what we're doing because this is going to continue forever. This is the magic elixir of energy and growth and jobs. And to question it is somehow bizarre, mad and irrational. And so the other part of hegemony, of course, is not just building the coalitions of allies in the political process, it's also creating the political frontier. You have to have an other that you're pushing back against, the bad people. So hegemony is held together not just by the coalitions of equivalence of interests and identities, but also difference from others. And this shot of parallels or contrast, say, the school climate strikes in Australia with miners for coal. And this was a response to the Stop Adani protest movement that was happening in 2018, 2019. This is up in Queensland. And there was a sort of an industry front group called Start Adani with a green logo instead of a red logo. So this conflicted politics, contested politics of coal, jobs and growth, must have it versus the growing sort of vehemence of social climate mobilisation. And that us and them aspect of hegemonic formations, you can see in other aspects around debates around developed and developing economies, jobs and growth versus environmentalists, citizens versus refugees. It's a common sort of binary that's created in a lot of political debates. So if I go through the three, very quickly, the three themes in the book. So we start off with the politics of climate mitigation. And it's really charting how the broader international commitments to decarbonisation that came out of COPs in Glasgow and elsewhere were latched onto by corporates like BP. I mean, BP was an interesting one right at the beginning of 2020. Their new CEO, Bernard Looney, comes out and basically walks over a Greenpeace protest outside the headquarters and says, yes, we're concerned about climate change too. We're going to be net zero by 2050 as well. Advisory firms like PwC, Unilever, Mercedes-Benz, all of the big corporates now committing to net zero is seen like a tick of sustainable legitimacy, and they're all doing it. But how do you then justify continued economic growth and possibly even also continued fossil energy into the future? So there's this interesting political play that's going on in the public mind about corporations can no longer come out and say, well, climate change is a hoax. Climate change is happening, we accept the science, and we've got ways to manage it. Interpretive denial, as Curry Norgard would term it. You reframe it into something that's more manageable. Net zero, sustainability, these sort of signifiers that can mean everything and nothing. And a key part of the corporate focus on decarbonisation and mitigation is this idea that what has been termed corporate environmentalism. The best way to deal with environmental problems is to let markets and corporations rip. Corporations can innovate. Corporations will create profit and value for shareholders, and they will solve environmental problems. A win-win. There is no zero-sum gain here. That's the discourse. And so there's General Electric with their Eco-Imagination initiative, which got a lot of traction in the 2000s, 2010s. And there's a lot of focus in these corporations on the ideas that greater eco-efficiency will solve the problem. They will become more sustainable because the carbon emissions per unit of production are less, neglecting the well-documented Jevons effect of greater productivity leads to increased consumption, which in the aggregate results in increased emissions. The corporations also become leading citizens in the fight against climate change. There's a subject position that's created for them at the front and centre of politics. And you can see examples here. There's Richard Branson, famous quote back in 2012, our only option to stop climate change is for industry to make money from it. Or Chevron, personifying themselves as a concerned mother and child. Yeah, we're an oil company, we're doing all this other stuff because we live on this planet too. We should be concerned, we are. So this discursive sort of response in the public space is about pushing back against the obvious reputational risks that big fossil fuel majors have as people get more and more concerned about climate change, but also staking claim for moral leadership. They're going to lead the response to the climate crisis. And at the same time, in terms of hegemonic formation, distinguishing themselves as the sensible people in the room versus those crazy kids, those extremists out there, the Greta Thunbergs, etc. Of course, you have to come up with solutions. So this was the Australian Coal Association some time back, and their solutions are carbon capture and storage. Aviation industry, we're going to develop sustainable aviation. They're going to evolve. Biofuel additions, carbon offsets. Of course, those solutions and responses can also generate a critical response. So we're not suggesting that people fall for that stuff necessarily. And so you get this contestation around the climate communications that corporates make, their advertising, their marketing versus greenwashing. Yeah, this is Balmoral Beach. Anybody recognise it?
This is you.
No, I didn't take this photo. That's not me. This was an article in the Mossman Daily some while back about how the Mossman Council decided to not acknowledge Bureau of Meteorology projections of sea level rise because that would affect property prices. And it was sort of like, hallelujah, Balmoral's saved. And I think the photojournalist decided to engage in a bit of editorial comment, so he got a guy in a suit, put his head in the sand. There's a quote from John Ehrenfeld here, which I think cuts right to the chase. And I teach programmers on sustainability, so But he says, we're not having an honest conversation here. We're talking about reducing unsustainability. We're not actually talking about what real sustainability looks like, starting from what is required biophysically and then working back. So there's lots of bright siding and obfuscation about, greater eco-efficiency, better green products and services, et cetera, but we're avoiding the elephant in the room. On adaptation, so this was a new tack for us with this book. And there is a growing corporate recognition that, okay, climate change is a present reality, too late to avoid it. How can business profit in this situation? And there's some really neat examples that we found of how businesses have sort of moved into the climate adaptation space as an area for new market opportunities, new products, new value creation for shareholders. So with risk comes opportunity. And one of the papers, well, in the book, actually, we talk about, biotech and pharmaceutical companies like CSL and Merck are anticipating growing demand for products because of new disease vectors. So, malaria, dengue fever, engineering contractor like Downer EDI foresees a future of worsening storms and severe floods that will create new markets for disaster recovery. So with every problem comes a solution. Well, it comes up an opportunity. Home Depot sees a boost in the need for air conditioning systems and ceiling fans. It goes on and on. There's lots of examples in the book. And of course, the Arctic is one of the ultimate sort of examples of this, this rush to get at increasingly ice-free water, not just in terms of minerals and resources, but fisheries. As the world's fisheries are going north and south, industrial fishing fleets are chasing them. Russia is a good example of some great quotes in the book about how Russian politicians and plutocrats have framed climate change as the greatest market opportunity they've ever seen. So Siberia will become green and an area for pasture and farming, etc. In Australia, of course, and this is another project I've been working on, political responses to the coral reef bleaching on the Barrier Reef. We've seen the way in which corporations have been placed in a sort of position of leadership by governments around responding, adapting, making the reef more resilient. This is the Great Barrier Reef Foundation. John Schubert, who used to be the head of ESSO, he says, while the world works to tackle climate change, many things we can do to build resilience to the Great Barrier Reef right now. A lot of corporates signing up for this. If you've been following Terry Hughes on social media, as we go through another current worst bleaching event right now, you see these puff pieces in the media about putting sound amplifiers on reefs and trying to farm coral and DNA stuff. And he's sort of saying, well, that's not going to save the reef. You need to cut fossil fuel consumption and global carbon emissions. That's about the only thing that's going to avoid that. But again, it's political positioning. And in the book, we also go to the phenomenons of potential geoengineering. That's the North Pacific, I think. That's that rogue geoengineering attempt in 2010 where the guy dumped the iron filings into the ocean to create an algal bloom. And then, of course, the billionaire space race, which was happening at the time that film Don't Look Up came out. Parallels were eerie. But the quote from Musk, that state aim of SpaceX is to make humanity multiplanetary. I mean, it's this sort of explicit acknowledgement, yeah, we've screwed this planet, let's go to the next one, sort of planetary colonialism discourse. Lastly, suffering, which is probably the toughest thing to write about in a sense, because then you're confronting the actual realities of what climate impacts are doing, mostly at an extreme level for developing economies, societies which don't have the resilience and the infrastructure to really adapt. And again, it's interesting how this is being framed in corporate, political and media discourse. This top shot is a shot still from the Nissan Leaf ad that you might have seen, the famous polar bear ad where the poor old polar bear treks out of the melting Arctic, wanders into an urban streetscape and ends up hugging this guy who's just bought the Nissan Leaf because nature thanks you for buying the electric vehicle. This ad from Peabody Coal, which creates this moral argument for continuation of coal extraction because they're bringing electricity to those in developing economies who are suffering from energy poverty. So it's a sort of a moral response to the critique. So it's interesting how the response to the evidence suffering is to frame the natural world and the developing world as a space for more green marketing. This quote from Rex Tillerson, what good is it to save the planet if humanity suffers? So we must continue to extract coal and gas so that humanity can not suffer. But of course, the reality is humanity will suffer as climate change unfurls. And so climate change in Western nations and the media and corporate communications becomes this sort of spectacle. And we talk in the book, Guy Debord's sort of argument about the spectacle in late 60s France, where he's brought a critique of capitalism. And so working with this concept in terms of how climate change now becomes the spectacle and how protest movements could push back against that perhaps. So this sort of use of commodified imagery, responses to climate change must sort of be framed around the idea of products and green products, green services we can buy into. Our role as citizens is to act as consumers. We can be concerned, but we must care at a distance by our engagement through consumption. And this sort of concept of the other comes through very strongly when we start to confront what's happening in developing economies in Africa and Asia. It's the distancing that is occurring. We in the West, in the US, and Australia and Britain can see these in our news feeds. We can engage with them. We can offer thoughts and prayers at a distance. And of course, the reality is the inequality is that a lot of these impacts now are the product of fossil fuel consumption that we have engaged in the developed north over the last 2 centuries. Okay, so lastly, very, very quickly, conscious of the time, there's 3 sort of, this is always the bit of the book that's the hard stuff. So you say, what's the answer? What's the solution? How do we respond? And we sort of hit upon 3 Ds to focus on, not arguing that these will necessarily solve the problem, too late to avoid climate change, but they're at the stages of harm minimisation. So one of them is the whole focus on decarbonisation. And there's a lot of activity happening there that is focused on trying to improve situations. So the whole fossil fuel divestment movement, for instance, that's come from social mobilisation. Proposals for carbon pricing and carbon taxes, which of course politically have not really succeeded. They've been gamed and pushed back against by conservative forces. We can dream about the possibility of regulated restrictions on fossil fuel extraction. That's going to happen in the current politics. Certainly a lot of incentivisation of renewable energy. So the Inflation Reduction Act in the US and all of the policies around the world to try and encourage greater renewable take-up. The just transition sort of arguments go, again, politically quite contentious. But these are sort of moves towards trying to push towards a decarbonisation at scale. Again, not wanting to put too much of a downer on it, but the dilemma is if we look at economic growth and emissions, the only periods in time since the 70s where emissions have plateaued or reduced have been in periods of major economic contraction. 70s oil shock, the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, the global financial crisis 2008, the COVID pandemic. So there is, again, we confront this problem of economic growth and carbon emissions, and the black line is annual average CO2 concentrations parts per million. And I think the other day it was 428, 426. So that's pretty grim. So simply decarbonising isn't going to be sufficient. So we have to look at these ideas that are starting to develop around degrowth. Again, attracts enormous controversy. Conservatives see this as sort of forced recession. Advocates like Jason Hickel and others argue it's about a managed recalibration of the economy, degrowing the sectors which are harming, contributing to the climate crisis and environmental collapse, growing the sectors which are benefiting people and communities. So things that focus on sufficiency, reducing working hours, greater localism. These are suggestions. They're certainly not attracting much political support, but they are responses to this conundrum between growth and emissions. And then lastly, democratisation. And again, you know, the 3 Ds look fanciful from where we are politically at the moment, but they are probably what we need to be looking at. The idea that we need to somehow recapture our politics, because our politics has been captured by powerful vested interests that want to ensure what's happening will continue, what the current state is will continue. And so social mobilisation, the school climate strikes, Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, these sorts of examples are examples of that grassroots pushback. And when we look at historically examples where major social and political changes occurred, it has typically started through social mobilisation, whether it's the civil rights movement or the fight for the female franchise or whatever it is. And certainly the green environmental movement has advanced significantly over the last decades. So yeah, those are 3 sort of Ds we come to in terms of response. But I'm going to finish it here with a lovely shot of Bill Gates embracing the earth and a cartoon that you've probably seen. Tom Toro gave us approval to use this in our book. So it's used a lot, but I think it captures a lot of the reality of where we are. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Chris. We've certainly got time for questions. Anyone would like to kick off?
I'll kick off. So you talk a lot about the tight coupling between fossil fuel use and the economy, which could be the main obstacle in getting people to agree that we should really do something about it. But isn't it the case that if you disaggregate the global economy, you can start to see examples where those things are decoupled?
Yeah, there's certainly
would be a good idea to emphasize those.
Yeah, there's relative decoupling in developed northern economies in Scandinavia and Europe, Britain. I mean, there's reasons why that has happened. Part of it is the whole geographic relocation of manufacturing industries and manufacturing products. So, you know, and in the British case, the demise of the coal industry. So, yeah, I think one of the reasons we see relative decoupling is this whole reorganization of the global economy. And that is true and is good, but it's not absolute decoupling. And really, the planet, as you guys as climate scientists would know, the planet doesn't really care about national emissions changes. It cares about the global situation. And really, global emissions continue to increase because globally, we still rely on more than 3/4 of our energy from coal, oil and gas. So in a sense, yeah, look, I agree. There are positive signs out there in terms of the increased investment in renewable energy. A lot of the new energy investment is very much focused on renewables. But we keep coming back to this problem. We've still got 80% or so of global energy consumption coming from coal, oil and gas.
Thanks, Chris. That was fantastic. Seems to me the pattern is concern about the changing climate and the solution is reducing carbon, which isn't working so far. So I just wondered, and you touched on alternate pathways such as geoengineering, and I wonder whether the reality is the horse has bolted with reduction in carbon and whether we should think about really focusing our efforts into completely alternate solutions.
Yeah. Has anybody read Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future? It's a fictional take of what this century will look like. It's really quite good. It's a bit didactic, but it's quite good. And it starts, the opening chapters, rugged. It's imagining in the 2020s, 2030s, a heat wave occurs in the Indian subcontinent, which is eerily similar to what we're actually seeing now, where the wet bulb thermometer goes beyond 35°C and power grids fall. And it's from the perspective of an American exchange student in an Indian village. Basically 20 million people die from this heatwave event. And one of the outcomes Robinson imagines from this is the Indian government then unilaterally send their planes up into the stratosphere to inject sulfur particles and calcium carbonate into the stratosphere to reflect solar radiation. So rogue geoengineering by a nation state. Another outcome that Robinson imagines is that a group called the Sons of Kali, or Children of Kali, I think it is, an eco-terrorist group are basically emerge and go around the world killing oil executives, which you could imagine if you were a survivor of a mass mortality event of that scale. So look, on geoengineering, it will provide a little bit of space in terms of heating of the planet. But once you start doing it, you have to continue to do it. If you're talking about stratospheric sulfur injection, one of those extreme events, extreme responses. And then, of course, once you stop, you get a massive rebound effect in terms of heating. It won't solve issues of ocean acidification because the oceans will still be absorbing all that carbon that's in the atmosphere. And we just don't know what the implications are of that sort of radical geoengineering in terms of rainfall patterns and weather patterns and stuff. So it's like, I think Michael Mann's, one of his books someone talks about it being like chemotherapy for a dying planet. The cure could be worse than the disease in a sense. You're sort of throwing a dart at the wall and you don't know what the rebound effect might be. The more sort of moderate geoengineering responses, and there's quite good Royal Society review document on geoengineering a few years ago, things like mass reforestation and those sort of things, yeah, they could be good. We should be doing more of that. Unfortunately, we seem to be tearing down forests, not trying to encourage greater natural resilience and improving carbon sinks, yeah. So yeah, I'm not in favour of radical geoengineering.
So Chris, I think the picture that we can paint of business sector is quite bleak because of its past performance. But if we think about the fact that businesses are probably the most powerful social institutions that we have, if we don't co-opt them in the journey, then it's unlikely anything will happen. And so if you look at things like reforestation based on carbon credits as a kind of market response to the issue of deforestation. Isn't that something that can also be, I mean, if it's done properly, in many cases it's not done properly, but it's possible to do it properly. I mean, isn't that part of the solution?
Yeah, look, I'd agree with you. And I think there were two things you said that are the key. if it's done properly in terms of regulation oversight. And as we've seen with the whistleblowers and the revelations on carbon offsets in Australia, it's clearly not being done.
Yes,
It's
yes.
been gamed. And yes, businesses are, as you say, global corporations are probably the most powerful institutions in the planet. We want to bring them into the process, but unfortunately, they tend to dominate the process. And the ability of governments to actually regulate what businesses do, as we all know, 50 years of neoliberalism is sort of fallen away. So our politics is controlled by those corporations, and we don't really have the ability to oversee their activities in ways that can be meaningful and monitored and regulated. I mean, I think the biggest problem is, as Naomi Klein pointed out, awareness of climate change arose politically in the late 80s, exactly the same time that the Eastern Bloc collapsed. And Fukuyama and others were saying, you know, triumph of the Western democracy, capitalism wins. So we've had this sort of scientific realization of an existential crisis that requires massive state and government intervention. But that is now seen as politically can't even be considered. You know, Ronald Reagan, whoever, government is the problem, and get government out of the equation. So unfortunately, we have a politics which is not fit for purpose for the crisis that we face. But I agree with you. There's lots of things there, like carbon markets and carbon taxes could work. And we sort of saw that in Australia with the clean energy legislation. You graph the carbon emissions Australia, it dropped when Gillard introduced that, and then Abbott got rid of it 18 months later and up again. So there's this political gamesmanship that's going on, and we see it in Australia around coal-fired power, renewable energy. Every time we get an intervention which could be good, it gets gamed and pushed back and mitigated and reduced. So, yeah.
Thank you for a very thought-provoking presentation. And one of the alternative paths you mentioned is degrowth. And whenever I think about climate change, and I agree that the whole ever-growing economy is like the main culprit here. But can we ever think to reduce that if it's in human nature to go ask for more and more and more? So I use this video of debate between market mechanisms and market mechanism not working. And one of the questions one of the professors said is that if you can make a company focus on creating cure for malaria rather than selling Viagra, then I'm all for market mechanisms. But his underlying thought is that that's not going to work, because selling Viagra is going to make more money than creating cure for malaria. Even if that still allows the company to have some profit, it's a bit less than selling Viagra. So with that kind of underlying mechanism there, can we ever achieve degrowth or slowing down of the economy if that's what's going to solve the carbon emissions? That's where I kind of start getting frustrated.
Yeah, in the book, we use the concept of imaginaries and political narratives, because I mean, the business as usual, of course, is magical thinking. It's an imaginary. We can keep doing what we're doing, keep consuming fossil energy. Degrowth, decarbonisation, democratisation are also sort of political imaginaries in a sense, because clearly they're not seen as realistic in the current political debate. Degrowth is, you know, regularly pushed back against as this fanciful thing, but this is fanciful too. So in a sense, what is possible is determined politically. And I don't think it's, you said there, it's sort of human nature that we want to grow and expand. I'm not sure if that's true. It's certainly is an advanced capitalist society that we all are sort of programmed around progress, growth, expansion, more. But if you look at the research from anthropology and other cultures which haven't sort of fallen into the web of sort of capitalist ideology, there's much more of a focus on sufficiency and not growth, which sort of parallels this sort of discourse you see around degrowth. So other cultures, I don't think it's innately human. I think there are other cultures that have demonstrated there is the propensity for sufficiency and a more sort of communal, sufficient sort of approach to the environment and nature. And it's really been the evolution of capitalism from the 1500s on, which has sort of created, Western Europe created this vision that everything must expand, everything must grow, value must be created. And we're captured within that. We can't really imagine our ways beyond that. That's why degrowth looks so fanciful. Doesn't mean it's politically realistic. I don't know if it is, but.
Given that and the previous question, the response about the need to co-opt business and have business as part of the solution. Having business as part of the solution in a degrowth
Yeah, well, that would be tough. We'd have to think about that. And the problem isn't about co-opting business. Business has co-opted us. That's the problem we're in. We're not in a power relationship where we can flip that currently. And that can only really occur through government. If you think back to the Great Depression and the New Deal and all of that, that was Roosevelt and government coming in and co-opting business to the task at hand and then to World War II. But we're in the opposite situation where the corporations call the tune and basically governments do as they're told. So yeah, look, I don't have answers here. We're in this hellish situation politically and environmentally. And all I can do is trying to, with Daniel and Vanessa, all we're trying to do in the book is to highlight that these are really big conundrums that we face. And yet a lot of the discussion around climate change is net zero, tick, done. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Super interesting. One thing that sort of kept popping into my mind when you were discussing the concept of hegemony and how it interlinks with all this was the decline of the sort of reliable media in society. And I was just wondering if you had reflections on how that intersects with sort of the perpetuation of these issues.
Yeah.
It seems like, the success of someone like Trump to completely polarize a place like America seems like it intersects in really important ways with this discussion and the road to democratization.
Yeah.
So just
reflections
on.
I think it's really relevant. And there's a lot actually in the book on this, particularly the politics of suffering, this concept of the spectacle from Du Bois, because in a sense, Du Bois was right in the late 60s, but the concept of the spectacle is probably even more relevant now, given social media and celebrification and all that stuff. We live in this media bubble now, which is all consuming. And so the dominant messages that come out, the narratives that are told that we consume, shape what's possible politically. And it's not surprising that the corporations spend billions of dollars in industries like public relations and marketing for that exact purpose. There's an American academic, Melissa Ronchik, has just written a really good book on the history of public relations in America and environmentalism from the early 20th century and the debates about Yosemite National Park and all that, all the way through the present day. And the role of public relations and media is really key. That Peabody energy example, bringing the developed world out of energy poverty up, was developed by Burson Marsteller, which is Madison Avenue's one of the biggest public relations firms in the year. So Australia was the pilot location for the Peabody media campaign for that energy poverty thing. And it was, you want to see an example of impact. PR agency develops in New York, Peabody floats it in Australia. Prime Minister Tony Abbott then mouths the exact lines to the Australian and the Murdoch media. Coal is good for humanity. And you can trace the line. It's not even conspiracy. There is a direct relationship. So there is a massive impact of media on this because the politics of climate change is being played out in the public space. And it's one of the reasons why when you go on Twitter or whatever, and you retweet or you post something about carbon emissions, you get these armies of climate deniers coming back at you saying, what hoax? What climate change? It's a hoax. You're a sham, blah, 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 blah. And probably a lot of them are bots, but in reality, there's probably a lot of crusty old guys or retired engineers who've bought into the whole thing that climate science has bumped them. And so Riley Dunlap in the US has written some really good stuff on how the climate change denial industry, he calls it, was created. And he charts how big fossil fuel companies funded think tanks that then promoted journalists in the media to then, and there's a nice little figure here, a little diagram with arrows. Yeah, totally. And in Australia with the Murdoch media, you don't have to look too far. Sky after dark, if you want some real craziness.
Chris, I know you end with your 3Ds.
Yeah.
And I know you didn't have as much time as you might have liked perhaps to have gone into those in more detail. Can I just ask you a couple of questions related to those?
Yeah.
First of all, I would have thought that you would see them as potentially interrelated, right?
Yes, they are. Yeah.
They are. But secondly, of those 3Ds, would you privilege one over the other two? In other words, to get the other two enacted, you might want one.
Well, certainly a lot of the focus, I think the dominant focus of those 3Ds amongst those who are climate aware would be decarbonisation. Yeah. That's where all of the focus seems to be around decarbonising electricity production, primarily getting off coal-fired power stations and going to solar and wind and battery storage. And you see that in Australia, obviously. And politically, that's probably the easiest to sell because governments can then rely upon incumbent energy companies like AGL and others to throw the switch, close down their old coal-fired power stations like Liddell and Bayswater and others, and go to renewable energy. And it's a sort of a corporate-friendly message because it's about you can create value here, you can create money. They're not so keen on distributed renewables and people putting PV on the roof and taking them out of the equation. But yeah, so decarbonisation is certainly one that has got probably more traction at the moment of the three. Degrowth seems to be something, from my reading of it, that a few academics are writing about, but doesn't seem to have much political traction. The most recent UN climate report actually used the word sufficiency somewhere in its chapter on the built environment, I think, so it got a bit of traction there, but it's I think my take on it's pretty marginal politically in terms of probably more important, but politically marginal. And democratization is at a higher level almost because it's attacking the whole political economy of the Western world. So we can see examples of democratization when people get out and protest and social mobilization, people acting as citizens, not just as consumers. But that's a huge ask because we are sort of programmed into this vision that our only role is to rock up to an election booth every 3 years and cast a vote. And then the rest of the time it's opinion polling and buying stuff. So the idea of encouraging greater deliberative democracy at a community level, like John Dryzik talks about, that's what we should be doing, but it's politically, again, really difficult to get across the line.
Sure.
I was thinking, do you also address tipping points in your book? Maybe those are like more near term.
Yeah, I can't remember. I think I wrote the chapter on the climate science and the planetary boundary stuff. So tipping points is probably in there, but I certainly used a lot of the teaching. And that, in a sense, thinking in terms of this, it has been used as a sort of a point to argue for the urgency of climate change around the West Antarctic and the Atlantic meridional overturning current. I think I've got that right. We're now starting to see Greenland, we're starting to see these tipping points at near breach or being breached. But it's part of that broader scientific sort of discourse to politicians and corporates to say, this is how urgent this is, because once we go beyond that, there's no coming back sort of thing. The dominoes fall over. And I know Will Steffen, when he wrote a really nice paper on the sort of the tipping points and the movement to new state change sort of thing. And so scientifically, obviously, it's very powerful, but I think politically it can be very powerful because it sort of highlights the way in which this is something you can't come back from. I don't get the sense it's been communicated sufficiently at a political level. I'm always amazed how politicians and corporate leaders aren't aware how late in the day it really is. They sort of think, oh yeah, global warming, it's okay, 2 degrees, by 2050 we'll be okay, and we'll keep trucking along, we'll be resilient. And there's a gross underestimation of how unresilient human societies are to what's coming.
And then maybe a more personal question. How do you keep your sanity? When you go home
Through waves, Milankovitch waves of depression.
I think my stuff is really hard to stomach sometimes, but yeah, you're on another level.
Where it really hits home is teaching this stuff. So I teach both postgrad and undergrad programs on sustainability. It's mostly in climate change. And it's really hard to calibrate the message in ways that don't send all your students in paroxysms of eco-anxiety, but also don't bright side that and give them all this hopium that all sweet and everything's fantastic. In some senses, I sort of envy those climate deniers because it must be really satisfying not have to know about the shit.
Yes. Yeah.
But yeah, I go through waves. And summertime, I read a lot of climate fiction, like Stanley Robinson type stuff. And then curiously, even though a lot of it's fairly dystopian, it's also, in confronting that stuff, it's almost sort of gives you a bit of a lift. Because then it's, I'm trying to think of, who's the guy, there's a writer who wrote about learning to die in the Anthropocene, is the title of the book. And he's an ex-US Marine, he served in Iraq. And the way he phrased it was, when we were in Iraq, every day you would imagine all the ways you would be killed that day, or could be killed, you know, IEDs, snipers, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, this is something that we did to cope with the horror of the conflict we were in. And he said, you know, in writing this book about the Anthropocene and it basically tours around the world and people's response, he says, it's a bit like that. You sort of imagine what could possibly go wrong. And in imagining it, it sort of enables you to go on, I guess, which is so paradoxical, but I sort of get what he's saying. I'm trying to remember his name. It'll come to me in a moment.
On that simultaneously happy and unhappy note.
Yes.
That's a great presentation and thank you for as I said in the introduction, for raising questions that need to be addressed and yes, they are confronting, but they need to be confronted. So thank you.
Pleasure.